neuroanatomy and neurophysiology of the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. So the first part, we're going to provide an overview of the entire system, and in terms of the anatomic division, the anatomic parts of the nervous system, and then we speak about the functional or physiological divisions. The nervous system has two anatomic divisions, two main divisions. Everything in the nervous system is going to be classified into one or two of these divisions. So the first one is the central nervous system, and that includes the brain and the spinal cord. The spinal cord is a continuation of the brain. The spinal cord has a similar structure, but to some extent similar, but for example, it has a cortex, it has a right hemisphere, left hemisphere, and it basically can think of the brain as the main part, and out of the brain you have like a big cable that connects to all different parts of the brain, and then this cable comes down, and out of it you make branches to reach the different parts of the body, because the purpose of the brain and the spinal cord, or the brain, is to control the functions, all the functions of the body: walking, movement, internal functions, blood pressure, everything that you can think about, and to bring sensation from inside the body and outside, legs, hands, and so on, to send it to the brain, so the brain can make sense of it, and it can guide the body as to what it needs to do. So in order to connect or to have full control over the body, then the brain has to have access, has to have communication, and send wires down to different parts of the body. And the different parts are the cranial nerves, and that come out of the out of the brainstem. They originate there. And then the spinal nerves, 31 spinal nerves that come out of the spinal cord, and then out of each nerve you'll have different branches that go and basically cover the entire body, inside and outside. So these are the main divisions: peripheral, the central nervous system, brain and spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, which is all the nerves that branch out of the brainstem and the spinal cord. Then we have the functional divisions or physiological divisions based on the function. What does each part do based on function? So the entire nervous system, again, conveniently, it is divided into two main divisions, and every one of these divisions has two subdivisions as well. So first we have the autonomic nervous system, which includes all the parts of the nervous system dedicated to the automatic operations of the body, like how you sweat, for example, how your heart rate is regulated without your control, your blood vessels dilate to lower pressure and constrict to raise pressure, breathing, and all of these, digestion, and so on. So all of these are part of the involuntary things that your body runs on its own using that system called the autonomic nervous system. The brainstem, it plays a major role in autonomic nervous system functions. So the autonomic nervous system has two divisions. One is called the sympathetic, and one is called the parasympathetic. So the sympathetic system is the one that makes the nervous system, makes the body exert energy. It makes it burn and consume energy to make it continue to function. And it gives you, for example, the stress response. When someone is feeling threatened or under pressure, there's a whole reaction cascade, that eventually it causes the person to burn a lot of energy and to deploy all the powers they have for a moment where they can stand to either fight or run away. And the parasympathetic system is the system that calms down. It kind of balances the activity of the sympathetic system by trying to calming down the body. For example, the sympathetic nervous system under conditions when the person feels threatened, for example. That system is going to send signals eventually to the adrenal cortices to release adrenaline, for example. And that is going to cause an increase in cortisol, the hormone cortisol in the bloodstream. And that's going to cause increased heart rate, and it will increase blood pressure, and it will eventually another signal goes to the thyroid to burn more energy so that the body can function, have the physical strength to face the threat. So then the parasympathetic system contributes to decreasing the release of these hormones, bringing back the body to its normal condition, to decrease energy consumption so that the person would have better chances of survival. It works with the rationalization system to make you think about what you do and the consequences. And based on that, for example, you can use that system when you think about things that are negative or threats, and rationalize them and see the reality of these threats. For example, with people who have phobias, they can relax their body, and as a result, they can overcome consequences of high blood pressure and cerebrovascular disease and so on. The somatic nervous system is the system responsible for motor activity, for motor movement, especially voluntary motor movement. Somatic means body. So it is the system that runs voluntary movement or enables you to move different parts of your body, and it has two pieces or two main parts. One is called the pyramidal and one is called the extrapyramidal. In effect, these two systems enable you to initiate movement, to control that movement and refine it, and also so to have gross motor and fine motor. So now let's look at the main systems, the main parts of the system. And we begin with the spinal cord, and then we move upward. So the spinal cord, as I mentioned, is a continuation of the brain, and it comes down, of course. It is continuous with the medulla oblongata, with the brainstem. And there's no barrier except that the skull, there's a hole in the skull, and as that spinal cord, as the brain continues to go down into through that foramen magnum, once it goes into the outside, into the spinal cord, then piece that is part inside of the skull is part of the brain, and the piece that is below that is part of the spinal cord. It is called this, the spinal cord. But there is no physical barrier, no anatomic structures that separate them. So all the parts of the central nervous system include the spinal cord, the brainstem, the cerebellum, that structure here, and the diencephalon, and the cerebrum. So we'll take one look at the main pieces, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Each one or some of these have different components in them. Like the brainstem has 3 pieces. It has the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain. The cerebellum, of course, by itself, it is one big structure, but it has other pieces. The diencephalon is made out of 2 pieces, the thalamus and the hypothalamus. And then the cerebrum has many different landmarks that we will discuss. So the spinal cord, it just as a cable, it goes through the little holes that there are canals inside of the vertebrae, and each canal exists posterior to. So this part, the body of the vertebra, is facing the inside of the body. The outside, where the spinous process is outside. You can feel it with your in the middle of your in the center of your back. So the spinal canal, or the vertebral canal, is posterior to the spinous process, and I'm sorry, it is anterior to the spinous process and posterior to the vertebral body. So typically we simply just call the different segments of the spinal cord based on the number of vertebrae it passes through. For example, say the cervical segment, the thoracic segment, the lumbar segment, and the sacral segment. So you can see now when it comes next to every vertebrae, it gives you 2 branches, 2 nerves. They are identical, like you have a right hand and a left hand. But each one of these, each one nerve, spinal nerve, is going to have a motor component, a motor branch, and a sensory branch. So you can get sensation from the same organ, and you can also will be able to move it. And we have 31 nerves branching out of the brainstem. So now we look at the the coverings that surround the brain, obviously to protect it. And the brain, the consistency of brain tissue is the same, similar to toothpaste. But because it is soft and vulnerable, it makes sense that it is encased inside of a hard shell to protect it against damage. And these are called so you have the scalp and you have the skull. But beneath that, then you have one layer called the dura mater, or one kind of level of protection, the top one, which surrounds the entire brain. But this is the uppermost layer, and of course it has 2 individual layers, but just know them collectively as the dura mater or the dura mater. They call it, the translation is the tough mother. The dura means durable. It means it lasts and it is tough. So, but I don't want you to call it this. Just call it the scientific name, the anatomic name, the dura mater, as in alma mater, or dura mater, whatever, as long as the spelling is correct. Under the dura, there is subdural space, and that subdural space usually if there's a blood vessel that ruptures, sometimes it goes to that space, and it as the blood pulls in, it pushes down onto the structures of the brain, and it causes herniation, it causes displacement of the tissue, it causes shearing of axons and poisoning. The blood has a lot of material that is toxic to nervous tissue. So beneath the subdural space, there is the arachnoid mater, or the arachnoid membrane, and that is called arachnoid because the structure of it and underneath of it, there are a lot of connective, a lot of connections, fibers that connect the brain to that membrane, and there are a lot of blood vessels, so the structure of it looks like a spider's web. And it has a lot of blood vessels there. Beneath the arachnoid mater, there is the subarachnoid space, and that space is filled with fluid that we know as the cerebrospinal fluid. Why do we call it? Because it surrounds the cerebrum of the brain, which is the main cover of the brain. And it also surrounds the spinal cord, cerebrospinal fluid. And then beneath that subarachnoid space, we have a very thin layer that is called the pia mater, or the translation is the kind, loving mother. So gentle, and it comes in contact directly with the soft tissue of the brain, and it doesn't harm it. It protects it. It gives the brain its consistency, and it holds it in shape. So these are the three layers: the dura mater, arachnoid mater or membrane, and then the pia mater, and then there is the subdural space, and there is the subarachnoid space, and the fluid is in the subarachnoid space, surrounding the entire brain, surrounding the entire spinal cord, and there is a system of ventricles, chambers inside of the brain, spaces that are filled with fluid, and that fluid is also circulating with the cerebrospinal fluid. So here we have, this is a live specimen, dura mater, and then subdural space, arachnoid mater or membrane. Beneath is the subarachnoid space, and it has the fluid CSF, cerebrospinal fluid, and then there is the pia mater, and then there is nervous tissue. So the functions of cerebrospinal fluid include, number one, serving as a cushion, for example, to cushion the brain and the spinal cord and protect them against impact, like when you run or jump and so on. And in addition, it actually makes you feel, it will make the weight of the brain and spinal cord less. So even though the brain is 3 pounds for the adult, we do not feel that we are carrying that. But more importantly, it serves as a constant, to maintain a constant external environment around the brain. For example, it maintains the temperature. It maintains a steady temperature. And how it does that is, your body generally, how it regulates temperature is by water. The water that you drink, it has the same body temperature. So when your body becomes hot, water just gets out, you sweat it, and it constantly are losing water from all over your body. But more, there are some parts like the head, you lose a lot of it, and if you feel it, because of the heat, it generates a lot of water, escapes and takes the heat with it, and it cools your body, your palms, your soles, the soles of your feet, for example. So again, maintains a constant external environment where the temperature stays the same, and that is to help the neurons and the cells that support the neurons to survive and to function. It also serves as part of the lymphatic system or the immune system. That system requires, it is like, you can think of it as a system of rivers and lakes, and you can send nutrients to the brain, large nutrients that do not go through the blood-brain barrier. So they are sent through the cerebrospinal fluid. In addition, the lymphoid system uses that uses the fluid as a way to communicate, for example, to enable the white blood cells that destroy pathogens and destroy or clean debris and stuff like that. They use the cerebrospinal fluid to send their waste out to the bloodstream. So eventually that goes to your kidneys extract the waste, and then you release it as urine, for example. So these are the main functions, 1, 2, 3, 4 of the cerebrospinal fluid. Know where that cerebrospinal fluid is and exactly what these functions are. So these 4 chambers that are inside of the brain, they are spaces that are filled with cerebrospinal fluid and circulate. They connect with the cerebrospinal fluid, and so this big one is the lateral ventricle. You have one in each hemisphere, so you have 2 lateral ventricles, and then you have the third ventricle, which is inferior to the lateral ventricle, and then there is a little cerebral aqueduct that is like a tube that where the cerebrospinal fluid flows into to lower areas, and then it goes to the 4th ventricle, which is right next to the cerebellum and connects also with the cerebellum. So 4 ventricles, 2 lateral ventricles, and one, the 3rd ventricle is called the 3rd ventricle, and then the 4th ventricle, and then you have the cerebral aqueduct that connects the 3rd and 4th ventricles. Now let's look at the brainstem. The brainstem consists of 3 major pieces, and it is like the bulb of the brain, if you will. So it has the medulla oblongata, it has the pons, and it has the diencephalon. I'm sorry, this is not part of that. It has the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain. All of these 3 are called the brain stem. So if you can ignore the pons for a minute, you can think of the midbrain and the medulla oblongata. They are really continuous with each other. They are bundles of pathways. Some bring motor information down, and some bring sensory information up. And what happens here is one of the cables called peduncles coming out of the cerebellum, the cerebellum here. One of these big peduncles comes as it exits the cerebellum. It goes around the brainstem and kind of hugs it, and it connects in the back. The 2 sides connect in the back, and they make that structure called the pons. We'll speak a little bit more about it when it comes. So the brainstem, it also has clusters of specialized neurons that controls autonomic nervous system functions, like regulation of breathing, how to switch from inhalation to exhalation, a regulation of, for example, some aspects of swallowing, taste, for example. In addition, the brainstem, along the edges of the brainstem on each side, there are 12 cranial nerves. Why we call them the cranial nerves? Simple answer. Because the roots originate inside of the skull, period. So then the rest of the nerve exits the skull, and it goes to connect on the face, on the inside of your mouth, your pharynx, and so on, and the neck, and the shoulders, and inside of the trunk. So these cranial nerves, again, only because only the roots originate inside of the skull along the brain stem, and there are 12 of them on each side. You can see them now here. For example, there is if you split this in the middle longitudinally, the right side will equal the left side symmetrically. So there's 2 of every one of these. So you have the cranial nerves organized from the first one, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, until you go to number 12, which is the lowest one, which is it is this one. Where's number 12? It's not showing. Here, it's showing here. The lowest one is the hypoglossal nerve. So we'll study this later. We can see the diencephalon here. That shows a good picture. The diencephalon consists of the thalamus. 2 of these are called thalamic nuclei. And the hypothalamus, which is like, the thalamus comes from the word chamber. Hypothalamus is like the lower chamber, and in front, the hypothalamus is connected to a gland beneath it that is called the pituitary gland, and that is for storage of the hormones that are produced by the hypothalamus. So, but now here's again an anterior view of the brainstem, the medulla oblongata. And then you have the pons, and then you have the midbrain. This is the lateral view. You have, you can see on the back there's the inferior colliculus and the superior colliculus on the midbrain. One controls hearing or processing auditory signals. One, the superior, processes visual, motor, integrates visual and motor signals. So generally, the brainstem is mostly dedicated to functions of survival. It makes you stay, it gives you arousal, which is the opposite of sleeping, but it doesn't give you, as far as we know, it doesn't give you much thinking or much cognition. Maybe the science is beginning to explore, but not on a robust way that we know about. So it keeps the person breathing, it keeps the person in a vegetative state, to be awake and to be breathing, have a living body, but not necessarily that it can do anything. So you need to have the functions of the cerebrum. So now, to reiterate, here's the brainstem. On top of it is the diencephalon, which is the thalamus and hypothalamus. And then there is the cerebellum in back here, in back of the brainstem. Everything else that you see that surrounds these structures is called the cerebrum. Collectively, brainstem systems, the whole brainstem, in structure, it has a system of pathways, again, motor and sensory pathways. Motor pathways carry information from the cortex down to the rest of the body to move muscles. And sensory pathways bring sensation up to the cerebral cortex. So sensory means afferent, Motor means if efferent causes an effect. And you can see now in this three-dimensional picture, the transparent picture, you have now the brainstem, you have the diencephalon, and then you have the cerebellum, and everything else above that, all of this big structure wrapping around, that is called the cerebrum. Do not forget this name, please, cerebrum. And do not confuse it with the cortex, because I'm going to explain what that is, what the difference is. So it provides, brainstem structures provide motor control for the head musculature, and also receives sensory signals from the skin and muscles of the head, and also, of course, different parts of the body as well, because everything that's in the spinal cord has to pass through the brainstem. It regulates levels of arousal and awareness through a structure called the reticular formation. That is, structure is like a little, it looks like a worm, and it spans the entire length of the spine of the brainstem, and it connects with the inferior prefrontal cortex here, and together they work together to give you arousal and awareness in that you call consciousness. And that system makes its own neurotransmitters that are used for regulating movement and for regulating some autonomic nervous system functions. The brainstem, in addition to having sensory and motor pathways, it also has nuclei. A nucleus, when you say nuclei here, it means clusters of cell bodies, and these cell bodies are specialized in a certain function, and they do not exist on the cerebral cortex. The reason we say this is that typically most neurons, they have their body in the cerebral cortex, and they send it to make the gray matter on the cerebral cortex, and then they send their axons down. All the axons, as they pass together down, they have myelin and they look white, and this is what we say white matter. So the gray matter, it is made out of cell bodies and neuron and glial cells that support the cell bodies and nourish them, and then the axons go down to connect with other areas. So, but inside, deep in the white matter, we have sometimes these, and also the brainstem, we have these clusters of cell bodies that do not live here in the cortex, they live being way down, and this is why we call them nuclei. And for example, here is the olivary nucleus. The olivary nucleus that plays a great role in hearing, for example. There is the cardiovascular system here, center. There's the respiratory regulating rhythm and regulating the cycle between inhalation and exhalation cycles. There are, so this is that yellow structure here, that is the reticular formation, that one for consciousness. And now look at the medulla oblongata here. When you split it in the middle, you get two pieces. They are bigger in the top and smaller in the bottom. We call these the medullary pyramids. The medullary pyramids, like upside down pyramids. And something is special about the medulla. This is because in the lower segment of the medullary pyramids, in the inferior segment of the medullary pyramids, there's an area where motor pathways from the right side of the brain cross over to the contralateral side of the body to control the contralateral side of the body. And we call this area of the crossover, where the left side neural pathways cross over to control the right side. So this crossover is called the pyramidal decussation. Pyramidal decussation. You need to know where exactly it is, and you need to know why, the significance, what it is. So where it is and what it is. It is the point on in the inferior segment of the medulla oblongata where motor pathways from the right side of the brain cross over to control the left side, to control the contralateral side of the body, and motor pathways from the left side of the brain cross over to control the contralateral or the right side of the body. So, in addition to these functions, again, some of the nuclei in the brainstem have particular, they mediate or control senses like hearing, balance, and taste. All of these functions are found in the brainstem. The brainstem, again, has structures or nuclei that control digestion, breathing, heart rate, and also play a major role in swallowing. The pons. So now you see, here is the pons. Here is the cerebellum. That is, half of it is cut. The cerebellum is cut sagittally now. So it has a right hemisphere and the left hemisphere, and you are looking at the right hemisphere because this view of the brainstem is a posterior view. You are looking at it from behind. On the left, you have a lateral view. So there's here there's an anterior view where you see the pons in the front, and here is a posterior view. This area, let's look at the pons here. There's a piece that is cut. That piece is cut. That is the peduncle of the cerebellum that is cut. So the cerebellum lies posterior to the pons, and the cerebellum has, as you could see, it also has cables. But instead of the brain has a spinal cord, the cerebellum has 3 cables. We call each one a peduncle. So one of these peduncles goes down to connect or to travel with the pathways of the spinal cord down. And then you have one that goes up to the higher levels, and it connects with the motor areas and the planning areas and so on in the higher areas of the brain. And then you have a middle peduncle that goes out, has of course right and left, goes out, and each branch goes around, and they meet anteriorly on the ventral aspect. They meet and kind of connect together, and they make the pons. So here you could see the 3 peduncles, like you could see here. One is going up to the higher parts of the brain here. That's called the superior cerebellar peduncle. And then there is the inferior that goes to the brainstem, the inferior cerebellar peduncle. And then you have the middle cerebellar peduncle that goes anteriorly and wraps around the spinal cord and or the brainstem, and then connects on the ventral aspect and forms the pons. So this is why we call the pons. It's a bridge. It's an extension from the cerebellum. So the pons, it connects the cerebellum to the brainstem and the rest of the brain. In addition, it serves as a major relay pathway to bring information from the cortex, especially the frontal lobe of the brain. The frontal lobe of the brain is dedicated to initiation of movement, and to planning for movement, and to execution of movement, making things happen. So all the motor commands are sent down through motor pathways. And there are two things. One, the command is issued directly to the areas where the movement is happening, like my hand, for example. So one copy goes to the muscles that move the hand. In the meantime, you send another copy to the cerebellum. Now, also the cerebellum is going to, when it gets information from my hand, like if I am closing my eyes and I'm looking at my hand, I know that it is closing now and it is opening my fingers, opening my hand and closing my hand. I can see. How do I know? Because I get sensation, proprioception, and from my moving structures, and that goes up to the brain. But as it's going up, as the information is being sent, a copy is also sent to the cerebellum. It's like saying this. Someone said to me, you know what? Every time you receive a message that says all, like reply all, then you reply all. Like it has many people and you are part, just you click and reply all. So the frontal, the motor and premotor structures send down to the areas that they want to move so that they can have them move. But in the way they they send them from a copy to the cerebellum. And then the areas that are moving also send back feedback to the frontal lobe, but in the way they send a copy also to the cerebellum. You can think of the cerebellum as the watchdog. So it has a copy of what the prefrontal cortex wants, what the planning centers want, what the movement is, how it is done, and so on. And it has a copy of the actual movements on the ground. So now it looks at, compares both of these and says, what, did you do this? You did. Did you do this? You did. Did you do this? No, you did not. And it flags any errors up to, it would send them to the motor areas and the premotor areas and the planning areas. And then that enables you to modify movement while the movement is going on. So the role of it is to edit motor commands, to ensure accuracy, and to ensure that what is intended is precisely carried out by the structures that are deployed. So the midbrain, the pons, by virtue of being part or connecting with the cerebellum, in that case, it conveys information about the activity of the cerebellum in terms of motor coordination, in terms of bringing information up, from the upper motor areas and motor planning areas of the brain, of the frontal lobe, down to the cerebellum. The midbrain, this structure, this green structure here, it's not really green, of course, just like that. And on top of it, you find the hypothalamus, the thalamus and the hypothalamus. That structure is mostly pathways, and it has origins of certain nerves, a number of nerves, cranial nerves. So it has cranial nerves that control eye movement. For example, eye movement, there's a nerve that moves the eyes side to side, one that moves the eyes up, down, like scanning down and up and sideways. One controls pupillary reaction, like when you flash a light into the pupils, they constrict, for example. So all of these nerves, the visual optic nerves, are on this, out of this area. And then it has a structure called the superior colliculus. You can see it here, this little bud, one here and then one here. And here It is the upper piece, and that is dedicated to visual, auditory visual integration. So it regulates eye movement, and also when you hear a sound, all of a sudden, instinctively just turn your body and look at it, and you fixate your eye gaze on the source of the sound. This is the structure that enables you to do that, the superior colliculus. And that reflex is called the visual auditory reflex. The cerebellum, in addition to, you need to add this, by the way, I cannot add every little detail, and I am not here to read slides. I am here to add in and to explain. So you need to really take from this recording the information that you do not find in the slides and include it where it belongs. So the cerebellum, in addition to editing motor commands to make sure that they match the intended purpose, and contributing to correcting the movement while the movement is ongoing, it will, it's like, for example, think about yourself dancing. Say there's a crowd and you hear the music, you look, you see people, performing. You always are watching. Am I doing the same? Am I, dance to the beat? Am I? And then you keep, as you do this, you keep adjusting your movements until you match everyone else. So it also modifies the force and the range of movement. When you shake hands with someone, how do you know how much pressure you put? Do you put too little? People will say you are not interested. Do you put too much? It will crush someone's hand. When you want to hold something like a spoon, how much pressure do you use, to hold the spoon? When you lift up something, how much force do you need? If you lift up so fast, all of a sudden something bad is going to happen. If you just go too slow, that is not functional. So modifying the force of the movement and the range of movement. The range is, for example, you want me to make a circle the size of a donut, for example. So I go like this, for example. That's the range of the movement. The donut can be this size. But if I go like this, that is not a donut. That is out of range. So I need to have the ability to match the size in my mind, the image of it, to the size of the movement, for example. It contributes to motor learning. If you want to say play golf or play a sport, that is the structure that hones your skills and makes you master the motor learning related to any skill that has physical sequences like karate, like any sport that you would think about, riding a bicycle and so on. Contributes to cognitive and language functions, and the right hemisphere of the cerebellum is connected to the left hemisphere of the brain, of the cerebrum, and the left hemisphere of the cerebellum is connected to the right hemisphere of the cerebrum. And it even influences social communication functions, the way that someone speaks and so on. The diencephalon, again, that is the two little structures sitting on top of the brain stem. And so you have the thalamus, two of them on each side of each hemisphere has one. And they are the size of a bird's egg. And if you look at the thalamus inside, it has compartments inside of it, specialized rooms inside of it that control particular functions. It has more than 10 structures each side. So one of these structures, as you know, that little piece that's called this little area here called the medial geniculate body, this structure is dedicated to hearing, to auditory processing. And it can amplify the auditory signals up to 50 times. 50, it makes them 50-fold, like louder and more intense. And we call, because of the function of this medial geniculate body. That is the anatomic name of it, but the functional name is, in neurological terms, it is called the auditory thalamus. So, and the major input that go to the primary auditory cortex comes from the medial geniculate body. So the thalamus generally serves as a gating mechanism to control sensory inputs and sensory outputs. So when you gate something, you want to make it not exceed and not goes far below. For example, auditory signals, they go into a pathway that goes to the auditory thalamus or to that medial geniculate body. So then, if the signals are too loud and go in, that system is going to muffle them down a little bit. If the signal is too low, it's going to up it, to make it louder by sending down to the cochlea and the lower brainstem structures and making them enhance the signal. So again, it controls the sensory stimuli by making them just right, moderate. So you wouldn't get too much stimulation. You wouldn't get too little stimulation. The hypothalamus, if you look more, into it here, it goes down here, and here's the structure of it. Here it is inside, and you could see this is where the hypothalamus is, and this is the thalamus, and the pituitary gland hangs down from the hypothalamus. The pituitary gland is not literally, it doesn't have neurons, it doesn't have any ability to do much, but it serves as a gland for the hypothalamus to store its hormones. The hypothalamus, for example, makes a hormone called the antidiuretic hormone that restricts or tells the kidneys to stop releasing urine. And if you drink coffee, for example, that is going to decrease the release of the antidiuretic hormone, and that causes you to make more urine, to go to the bathroom. So it also makes hormones like vasopressin. It makes sexual hormones known as gonadotropic hormones to enable the body of a child to transition, to grow features like a male or a female. For example, that is the area. It is the structure that makes you feel thirst. And it is the structure that makes you feel joy and desire, physical desire. The structure that controls endocrine functions like, milk release, lactation, for example, is activated here. It is connected extensively to the autonomic nervous system, and it plays a big part in the autonomic nervous system, and it has extensive connections with the amygdala, which is your fear processing center and your emotional center. So when you get that signal about something that is scary, something that is dangerous, you face it immediately. You get that signal sent from the amygdala to the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus sends to your autonomic nervous system messages to start to deploy all the energy in your body to go into that fight or runaway mode. Now we move on to the biggest structure of the whole brain. That is the cerebrum. It makes up 77% of the total weight of the brain, the cerebrum. And it is made out of mostly gray matter and white matter. Gray matter mostly has the cell bodies and the dendrites, and it has cells that support the neurons that are called glial cells. And these feed the neurons, cushion them, give them myelin, and play many functions to help neurons. Without them, the neurons cannot survive. The cerebral cortex, the cerebrum, do not confuse these terms. No, cerebellum, we explained it. Cerebrum is that big, gigantic structure that has one right hemisphere, one left hemisphere. And then the cerebrum is going to have a lot of landmarks that we will discuss. But it has more than 13 billion neurons, and they make more than 60 trillion synaptic connections. It consists primarily of gray matter, and the gray matter consumes more than 94% of the oxygen supply because it works. It is like factories. All the bodies of these neurons are working constantly. So that is the cerebrum. You can see the brainstem, the Diencephalon, which is made out of the thalamic nuclei, and the hypothalamus. And you have the cerebellum. All of this yellow structure that is convoluted, and it has, like little mountains or hills and valleys, that is the cerebrum. That is the cerebrum. It is, again, the top layer of it is called the cortex, and it is made primarily of gray matter. Beneath the cortex, you have all these threads, all these axons coming down and making the white matter because they have myelin. Myelin is made out of fat, and fat is white, so that is why we call it the white matter. So the cerebrum has two hemispheres, right hemisphere and the left hemisphere, and the connection between the two hemispheres is called the corpus callosum. So see, that is like a bridge that connects the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere, and the corpus callosum basically is a structure where all these pathways and networks and that come from one hemisphere are all bundled into a big cable, and that cable is connected with the other side. So that is your the biggest highway. When there's a highway like this in the brain, a major connection area, we call it commissure. So this is the largest commissure in the brain. This is a longitudinal view of it, and you can see it here. In here, you see a transverse view of it, coronal view here. And this is the cortex in the top layer here, like 4 millimeters, less than for like way less than a quarter of an inch, much less than a quarter of an inch. So exactly 4 centimeters thick. That will be gray matter, and that is called the cortex. Cortex means means tree bark. So it is like they call the cortex the outermost layer that lines up the cerebrum. So we call it, instead of saying the cortex of the cerebrum, we call it the cerebral cortex. And the two hemispheres, the right hemisphere controls the left side of the body, and the left hemisphere controls also the contralateral or the right side of the body. The parts of the cerebrum, it is divided into the following, and you need to really keep track of this because your textbook might not address some of these. These are based on the most recent, and they come right from neurology sources. So you have the cortex, the outermost layer of the cerebrum, and it wraps all around it, and it's mostly made out of gray matter, because cell bodies consume a lot of oxygen, have a lot of glucose, and the color of that mix, glucose and oxygen, that is gray. It is pearl gray. This is where the name comes. And the white matter makes the biggest in size, but not as heavy. It is deep and vast spaces beneath. As you could see, this is the white matter. Here, all of this is the white matter. And it is made out of axons and groups of axons that make pathways and commissures. And then we have the basal ganglia. I'm going to explain what these are. And then the hippocampus and the amygdala and the corpus callosum. All of these are part of the cerebrum. Cerebrum. Please do not forget this name. So we will take these, we'll explain what these are. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Now, the cortex of the cerebrum has several pieces. So, but let's begin and address each one. The corpus callosum is the major highway, the biggest commissure in the brain. It connects right hemisphere to left hemisphere. Callosum means callus, means tough, condensed, packed, and it is basically it connects every pathway in the right hemisphere to every pathway in the left hemisphere. So it is for sharing information, integrating information, and so on. So when you say something, for example, that comes from your right ear, that has to goes to the right hemisphere, has to cross over. Right ear. It crosses over to the left hemisphere. If you have something from the left hemisphere, left ear, it travels to the right hemisphere. It has to cross over, go through the corpus callosum, and go again to the left hemisphere. So it is the biggest highway for information between the two hemispheres. And it is central for the integration of sensory, motor information, emotional and cognitive functions, and for all kinds of functions that you perform to share functions between right and left hemispheres. The cerebrum also has the structures that are deep in the white matter, in the core of the brain, sitting around the thalamus, around the diencephalon. And see the diencephalon here, the thalamus in brown. Next to it are two structures here, the globus pallidus and the putamen. So, and then you have this tail coming out and dropping, going around. And that whole structure here, all of this blue and dark blue areas, this is called the basal ganglia. So if you make a coronal cut right here, you're gonna see the basal ganglia like here. You can see all these structures, globus pallidus, you can see the putamen, and you can see some other subthalamic nuclei, but these are the basal ganglia here. And there's one of these little, that little piece is this tail cut. So anyways, this structure works with another structure nearby to give you what is called the limbic system, that is dedicated for emotions, emotional processing, fear, and learning. So all of these systems together. The basal ganglia, and the very end of the caudate tail here, the very end, you have this little structure that we know as the amygdaloid body, or the amygdala. And that structure is your fear processing mechanism, and also processes social information and stores social memories. And it has direct access to the hippocampus. That hippocampus is your memory processing center. It doesn't store memories more than an hour. It just, the information comes in from different senses, goes here, gets sorted out and processed, and kind of, if you will, tagged in terms of importance. This is highly important, this is important, and so on, based on the importance, and prioritized. And from there, this hippocampus works with the anterior part of the frontal lobe. We call it the prefrontal cortex. There's a big pathway between these two. When you get information, new information, it gets sent back and forth, back and forth, back and forth between these structures. And then the information will be sorted out and sent to the different storage areas on the cortex. Only the cortex stores information. So, but the hippocampus sorts out memories, helps you connect the new information, process it, and encode it, and send it to be more processed with the frontal cortex to decide what to take in, what to discard, and then send the information finally through the pathways to the storage sites. When you want to recall the information or retrieve it, you go to the hippocampus, and then from there it activates the pathways. It gets you all the information. The hippocampus is like, imagine a switchboard at a say there's a hotel that has 1,000 rooms. There's the service desk has a button to connect to every single room. All you want to say, give me the person in room 2,000, room 1,000. Click, and they can connect you directly to that room. So if you want to recall anything. Now, when we give you questions, true, false questions, multiple choice questions, it is new information often, and we intentionally try not to involve the hippocampus. We just directly activate the pathways, to storage sites directly by giving you all the choices and say, okay, the information is in your mind here, in your brain. You can just tell us if you have recognized it. But if we give you short answer questions, then you have to go through the hippocampus. The hippocampus has to light up these pathways, get you the information, integrate it, and put it on paper. So there are purposes for every part of what we do. So the basal ganglia, they have 5 major structures. These that are deep in the core of the brain, within the white matter. And one structure is called the putamen, one is called the globus pallidus, one is called the caudate, this structure, and one is called the substantia nigra, and one is the subthalamic nuclei. So all of these here are called the basal ganglia, these structures. And this is part of them as well. The functions collectively, because they play great functions, and we cannot definitely discuss in detail here. So they have 3 major pathways. Let me see if I have an image. No. 3 major pathways that connect them to the motor areas, the planning areas, and to the frontal cortex, here, the prefrontal cortex. And what they do is they serve as major processing centers for motor regulation and refining of motor movement and the strength of the motor movement, for transmitting, for conveying the information, motor information, to lower parts, and for receiving information from lower parts, from the thalamus as well, communicating with the thalamus to control the force of movement, and also to decrease the force of movement. They play 3 major functions. One is motor regulation, one is mood and emotional states regulation. Do not, please, when you give me answers, Do not just write them as they are on the slides. This doesn't tell you much. This is why I'm explaining. Regulation of motor functions, for example, in terms of slowing the speed of motion, decreasing the pressure, for example. Regulation of mood and regulation of emotions and emotional states. Language and social pragmatic says, what does that do? It is also for regulation of language functions, especially as they pertain to social interactions, to enable you to have normal social communications with others. So these are the major functions, but they play many other functions. So the hippocampus, I just explained what the functions are and what it does, and it is a major structure in processing information. If that is destroyed, the person will not be able to form new memories, and they will not be able to recall old memories as well. So this structure is buried deep inside of the temporal lobe. So you have here the temporal cortex has 3 lobes: superior, middle, and inferior temporal gyrus. And from there's auditory centers here, and inside you have the hippocampus. So the communication between the auditory areas and the hippocampus enable you to connect words with their meaning. So this helps in storing the information, priming it to be stored, enables you to recall, and enables you to consolidate your information. Also, while you are sleeping, it works with the storage sites, and it tries to prime the pathways by firing through the pathways frequently, numerous times, especially while you are sleeping. Keep that pathway firing until the information gets consolidated and becomes stable in your brain. The amygdala, that is here, as I mentioned, lying next to the hippocampus. The amygdala has a special way of activating the hippocampus immediately. If there is an event or something going on that has emotional significance, immediately, whenever the amygdala is activated, the hippocampus is activated. This is why highly charged emotional events, they have high priority in terms of being processed into the memory system, unless of course they are so overwhelming that the brain cannot take it. And this is where the hypothalamus will play kind of to block, and with other mechanisms to block these severely devastating memories, to block them, and gradually you come to terms. You start to accept one piece at a time until you are ready to accept the whole truth. The amygdala is connected to the hypothalamus, and it immediately stimulates endocrine responses to emotional stimuli. For example, if a mother has a baby, and she leaves the baby in the house, for example, and she goes down to the store to buy something, and then she hears a baby cry in the next aisle. That cry, even though that's not her baby, is going to cause the milk to come out, because she is a mother, she is a breast, in time she's able to make milk and produce milk, in other words. So, but any baby in distress or crying is going to make her release to lactate in response. So that is the emotional response induces release or activation of endocrine responses. Endocrine has to do with the glands and the things that produce like milk or tears or saliva and so on. It has special connections with, and it activates the hippocampus. So this is why emotionally charged or emotionally salient events and experiences activate the thalamus, the hippocampus, and the events become highly memorable, and it stores also the amygdala itself. It has components to store socially relevant information, especially like you have a good time somewhere, and you know, that gives it that joy when you remember that event. So now, speaking about lateralization, language lateralization, that's what I mean. Language lateralization. What does it mean? It means that both sides of one hemisphere of the brain has certain language functions, the other has other language functions. What is the purpose? That the brain has different parts and every part does different things. The whole idea is you have a limited space here and you want to make the best use of it. Say we have one classroom, and that classroom we want to make the very best of every single individual. We want to make every single individual contribute in a big way to the classroom. So instead of having 2 engineers in the class, 2 students, just engineers, maybe we could have 1 and have the other person become a physicist. 1 person can become a chemist. 1 person can, everyone does a different function, but all of them share what they have. So you can do more with little. And this is why the brain assigns compartments or areas that are called modular units, specialized in certain functions. And these functions are shared, and then they receive information from other parts and so on. So the left hemisphere is specialized in the fundamentals of language, the basics of language. It has the vocabulary, it has the phonemes, phonemic processing, it has sentence processing, it has production of words and sentences, the ability to comprehend and understand and recognize speech. All of this in the left hemisphere, basics. But the left hemisphere is literal. Like if you say, he kicked the bucket, the left hemisphere goes, oh, so imagine, oh, he did. A person had a bucket and kicked that bucket. That's it. It has nothing to do with anything else. The right hemisphere is going to look at the whole picture and say, oh, wait a minute. Why did the person say this in this moment? What does that mean? And then suppress that network that gives me the false literal interpretation. I have another one based on the real meaning that is not said in the words. It means that person died, for example. So the right hemisphere does holistic processing, gives you the whole picture. And for example, reading a story, you look at the story as a whole structure. Reading a paragraph, you look at it as a unit and you extract the idea or theme out of that unit. But the individual pieces are processed in the left hemisphere. Anything that goes inferential, it goes beyond or between the lines, it is right hemisphere function. So left hemisphere has syntax, word semantics, speech recognition, analytical skills, and processing of the speech acts that show a conflict between speaker's intentions and the speaker's utterances. That is, it means lying. It detects if someone is lying or someone is making up things. Maybe they are not lying, but they're called confabulating. Maybe they have a mental illness and making up things. So the right hemisphere is specialized in holistic processing or global aspects of discourse production, like how to organize and produce a cohesive story that has a nice beginning, has details, it has a middle, and also facial expressions and the tone of voice. It processes the speaker's intent and the context. Why are you telling me this? You know, what is your intention? Maybe you are trying to trick me. Maybe you are trying to convince me to do something. Maybe you're trying to make me buy something from you. Theory of mind. It makes you recognize that other people, just They happen to be just like you. They happen to also have their own ideas. They also happen, like you, to have their own feelings, their own emotions, and their own ideas. And that the fact is that their beliefs, their ideas are as important to them as your own beliefs and own ideas are important to you. And if you know that, you will be able to avoid conflict with them. You will be able to predict what will make them upset, what will make them happy, how they think. You can take their perspective. And if you are able to, whatever you say is not going to cause a conflict, it's not going to cause a bad relationship, and it goes this way. You'll be able to predict what people will do in reaction to what you say to them or what you do. So theory of mind is a big thing that you need to understand, and you will be hearing a lot about it in different classes. The right hemisphere is also specialized in inferencing. It can get information that's not directly stated, but information that's implied in the global aspects of discourse production, like producing an entire story that has connected pieces and sequenced pieces that make sense, and then also processing the whole idea of a book or a story, and reading and comprehending information on that level as well. But the real complete understanding and production of language is going to depend on the integration of the right hemisphere functions with the left hemisphere functions. When you put them together like this, you have a whole brain, a whole person. But if you split them, if you only have one left hemisphere, you are gonna be missing a whole lot, and they cannot function without each other, and the fact that they complement each other. So again, in the neuro class, you will hear a lot about this. One last thing that is not mentioned here that you need to take note of: before age 1 year and a half, before 18 months of age, both hemispheres can process all aspects of language. Beginning at age 18 months to exactly 20 months, the left hemisphere begins to specialize in the areas of the language, fundamentals of the language, as I explained. Remember, at 20 months, that major shift happens when the left hemisphere takes over the functions to process the fundamentals of language. And the last thing I add is, if there is a necessity to remove the left hemisphere from the brain of a child before 18 months, for example, because of seizures or whatever it is, and the entire left hemisphere is taken out, of course, cerebrospinal fluid will fill the space. But if it is before 18 months, the right hemisphere will be able to assume all functions of language, and the child will grow up, if they have the right communication and stuff, they will be able to develop almost normal language, believe it or not, because the right hemisphere will compensate and will take over. If that surgery is conducted after 20 months, that doesn't happen, and the person is going to have abnormal language development. I'll leave you with this, and I will record the next set, and we'll post it as well. Thank you.